Welcome to Just Between Us Girls. This is Columbus's hub for inclusive conversations on building success in male-dominated fields. Whether it's through empowerment, support, or advocacy, we talk all things professional development and breaking the glass ceiling. Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Just Between Us Girls. My name is Arianny Damian, Business Development Director of Thompson Restoration Associates, and today we have
Alissha Mitchell with OhioHealth Corporation, OhioHealth Real Estate Group.
All right. Thank you so much for joining the episode today, Alissha.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to have you on because you bring a lot of different perspective. And today, I think that there's a lot of conversation our listeners, not readers, will be able to leave with. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks for
having me. Tell me a little bit about what you do with OhioHealth, what that looks like, and a little about how you got into this.
Sure. Well, I have been with OhioHealth for about 3 years. I manage the commercial portfolio that is centered mostly in the northwestern downtown area, Arlington, Grandview, and I manage anything that is not attached to a hospital. So that can be an urgent care, that can be a freestanding emergency department, and then also medical office buildings, so commercial medical office buildings.
Beautiful. And how did you end up at OhioHealth and really in commercial real estate in general?
I worked for a wonderful company, NAI Ohio Equities, for a number of years. I started out on the residential side there, and my former VP had an opening in high-rise condos, and said, hey, would you be interested in it? And I'm like, yes. Because at that point I managed or worked in at least 2 high rises, one which was commercial mixed use. And so that gave me a new perspective from the residential side that I had pretty much about 15 years of my career had spent in the residential sector. So took that opportunity, moved over to commercial, and haven't looked back since. I really enjoy the commercial side.
Yeah. What would you say are like the main differences between residential and commercial, and what do you think in your experience really separates the two?
So you still have the tenant relation, resident relation aspect where you are providing a high level of service, attention to detail, all those things. But I think the biggest difference between residential is very simple. I mean, that's their home. So there's an emotional attachment. Oftentimes in a commercial setting, the emotional attachment isn't as prevalent so much as that's a business investment. And so how your obligation on the residential side is that someone can reside in their home safely and happy and free. In a commercial space, they are operating their business, realizing their revenues, and serving their customers or clients or whatever the business entity is. So it's just a little different, nuanced, but still the same in the approach of you want to still provide a high level of personal touch service. It's just different.
I definitely agree with that because in our industry, and particularly like in the restoration side of things, so whenever we have a residence and it's, even if it's like a multifamily apartment and we have all these different, residents that are like, okay, at the very, very minimum, we're worried about where am I going to sleep tonight? What is what is going to go on with this? How long is this going to take? And where a lot of times the question on the residential side is like, how long?
There's
a lot
of commercial.
Yeah, I was gonna say, with commercial, there is definitely that aspect of it. But with commercial, people can be a little bit more patient because they're looking at it more from like, we'll do what it takes to get things running again. And on the residential side, they're more like, who is paying for this and how are we gonna, and it's a little bit of a different experience, and we find it that there's a lot more hand-holding and explaining involved and things like that.
I think you still have an obligation to explain to and set proper expectations for tenants on the commercial side. So, I mean, ultimately their goal is how quickly can I get back to operating my business? And that should be your obligation too, right? Like how can I get them back to doing what they do every day? How can I minimize the interruption to them as much as possible? And sometimes the interruption is what it is, right? And then other times, like if there's stuff that can happen after hours or, out of the way where it's not causing
like major
distress to a patient. Like in my case, at OhioHealth, we also have standards on noise control in our buildings.
Because you're dealing with the medical side of things as well.
Yeah, and so you got to imagine, depending on why a patient is there, to be sitting in a medical building and listening to drills going off somewhere down the hallway, it could be very upsetting. So a lot of our work oftentimes is after hours. In fact, when I'm bidding scopes of work and I look at them like, is this after hours?
Yeah.
Because they're usually giving it to me and it's for, normal business hours. And I'm like, I need you to run that back and put some after hour labor into that. So, I mean, ultimately, it like I said, it's important to explain to the tenant what the timeline will be. I think communication is key.
It's the number one.
Like, you tell them what's happening when it's happening, and even if you don't have a change in what you have to tell them, keeping in constant communication and updates is really important.
Yeah.
And I think largely people value that.
I always say, and that's one of the things where like we ended up bringing on someone that's solely dedicated to the communication piece of things. Because I mean, if you think about the number one thing that people get on contractors for is communication.
They didn't tell me anything.
And they didn't say anything. And at the end of the day, no update is still an update. I'm sorry.
Well,
I need to know.
In the absence of information, people fill in their own gaps.
Yes.
And naturally humans default to
build the narrative.
And if it's a really negative situation, like we talked about my basement flooding and all the emotion that was going around it, I think the reason I was able to kind of separate myself from what was happening, I was still very emotional when it happened, was I understood and I trusted the contractor because they did restoration and water mitigation in my buildings. So I understood intellectually what was happening, so I could sort of process that my whole life was like going downstream at the time. So,
quite literally.
Yeah, it really was.
It's one of those things too, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's actually something, and this goes kind of off where we were going, but that speaks to you getting to know your vendor and understanding how they communicate and what you both have these certain, you've had a relationship, you understand what's going on.
It's imperative.
Yeah.
And I would say largely, I'm tough with my vendors, but I also trust them. I get out of their way so that they
It's like being a parent.
Yeah. I trust, but I verify. And I believe that when I pick up the phone and call that I'm going to get a straight answer. They're going to do what they can to get my buildings back up and running. So I mean that takes time and years to like build that sort of trust and relationship so it was a good experience.
Yeah.
In spite of having,
I was going to say, in the end, especially with a lot of what we do being just like accidental, like there's nobody to really blame in the process of it all. A lot of the times, you end up in emotional discussions and things like that with people that kind of are searching for a place to place their frustrations. And that's where communication really, really comes in the most, right? Because that's where you really need to step up and be like, listen.
And I would think in your business, because you mostly do residential.
We do a split, residential and commercial.
And at least on the residential side, having people that, when those crews arrive, those emergency crews, just being able to provide a level of empathy in the moment is huge. And that was really, I think, what made the difference for me is that, and that time where I was, looking at very precious, treasured memories that were potentially lost. Just to have them stop and give me a very human, empathetic moment. And I think that translates whether you're in commercial or residential. To just stop and say, I know this sucks, right? This is really bad, and we're gonna get through it. So that's really important.
Has there been a moment in your commercial career where you have been dealing with, high intensive emotions, an emergency of some kind, something like that, and you kind of had to lean more on that empathetic response and more just, rather than it just becoming a business transaction, leaning right into that human aspect and how it's changed things?
And I think it's easy to slip into that like sort of robot mode when you're in commercial.
Yes.
But
and that's why I asked.
That's something that you have to like really dial or check at the door. Working in healthcare, in the healthcare industry, like, you know, the mission is the mission, which is to take care of patients.
Yeah.
And we see patients at the start of life, and we're seeing patients through the end of life, and then all the things, the touch points in between. And one of our missions is to create memorable moments for people. And so just because I'm a property manager, I try not to reduce that to something that's not. No, I'm not a surgeon, and probably you don't want me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna faint. I'm gonna faint. You don't want me around the blood and all the really important stuff. But if I can create a space that is comforting and safe when someone's getting some of the worst news of their life, or they're not worried about, oh, it's too cold in this space, or it's too hot and I'm not comfortable and I don't feel well. That's where I deliver on the mission that we have at OhioHealth. And I think that's really the case in all instances. When there's something happening, people don't stop being human just because they're in a commercial building, right? Like, they've got to figure out how to come to work, how to, you know, deliver whatever service that they have to deliver, deadlines that they have. And so I think just checking into that time that I spent on the residential side is something that I dial into every day. Even when I'm meeting with a tenant just to do like building rounds, I don't use commercial experience. I use my residential experience. And I spend, because you're touching a human. Yes, and I spend time getting to know like how they tick, what's important to them. I can almost tell immediately when I walk into my building if the nurse or the practice administrator is having a bad day. Like, and not just because she's like presenting that way. I can almost tell just because I've spent the time to just try to understand, you know, what makes her tick or make him tick in those moments.
I think that's one of the things that sometimes is overlooked, is that we expect a lot of times people to be in our same state, or we expect people to be very similar to us, you know, or think similar.
Meet people where they are.
100%. And I always tell people, you know, even if you are trying to bring someone's mood up or get them kind of closer to where you are, perhaps, I can't remember exactly who had this rule, but they would always say, you know, you look at the baseline of where this other person is at, and you say, how do I just go one notch above? And if you go one notch above and they meet you there, and you go one more notch above and they continue to meet you there, you can eventually kind of raise the level of
you're sort of pulling them out of that moment. And sort of getting them to pause. Like, I know this is going on right now and this is a lot, but if you can give them a moment of pause to, like, you know, just come in where you are, and then you take them to wherever you want to go. I typically don't try to distract that much. If I can at least get you here, then we can get through, because there's something that I need to communicate. Like, I'm not in a building just for kicks and giggles.
Exactly. I didn't show up here to say what's up.
No.
And sometimes that emotional firewall can really create a sense of larger distance, where they almost feel like you're on the opposing side or something, and you have to come in and just kind of be like, you know, we are on the same side.
I would hope none of my tenants would feel that way. And in fact, they often say that, like, tenants or residents even, I didn't want to be a bother, or I didn't want to bother you. And I'm like, that's kind of
this is what I do.
Like, it's okay. So I try to reassure people whenever they do call, like, call me. Yes, absolutely. You can text me, you can call me, you can email me. Usually I'm not sitting at my desk unless I'm in a meeting. Or when I'm in meetings, I'm not sitting at my desk. So a text is always, that gets me right away. It's the quickest, fastest way. But
and I'm sure your tenants know that about you.
And
understand that.
But, you know, they still, like, in a moment, they're like, I don't want to be a bother. But I also think when someone is picking up the phone and calling you, that also speaks to a level of confidence.
I agree. I think that we're also in a different, like, space in terms of how people want to communicate too. Like, I'm like, things have definitely changed.
I hate it.
I know. Because here's the thing. I'm like very much first, my number one priority, I'm an in-person girl.
Yeah.
I'm like, meet me here.
Yeah.
And if not, I like to feel people's energy. I like to pick up the phone.
Well, there's so much that gets lost in email
Yes.
and text. And like, if I've gone back twice, it's time to pick up the phone.
Yeah, let's just talk. Let's get into it.
Let's hammer it out. 'Cause
I agree.
There's something that's not translating, you know? And I'm not a fan of like 30-person emails.
Yes.
Like, I don't even know who I'm talking to at this point. You know? So yeah, that's definitely a thing. In today's
world. Well, shifting gears a little bit, I definitely would love to chat a little about, you know, when we talk about memorable moments and even memorable people in our careers that have shifted things for us. I remember you in one of our discussions kind of talking about this boss that you had and walking into a room and seeing another woman of color in a senior position and something you weren't used to at the time, and I'd love to kind of hear about that experience and maybe how that has molded some of your experience as well.
So in 30 years, nearly, I've only had 2 women of color that were like either a direct report of mine, where I reported up through, and that was my regional manager when I worked for Edwards Communities years ago, and then my former director at OhioHealth. And I can tell you, both of those women, very strong, smart, charismatic, and I learned different things from both of them at different points in my career too, right? When I was at Edwards, I was still kind of coming up through the ranks, although managing, and that regional really taught me how to understand my property and its overall financial performance. Man, she was tough as nails.
You gotta be though. You gotta be.
She was tough as nails, but to this day, if I think of her, I immediately think of nothing but what a high level of professionalism and just delivery of a standard. She really honed in and taught me the value of standard delivery of service. And then having my director for the first time at a high level like that, an executive level, it was transformative for me. In a way that, you know, particularly in commercial real estate, where women of color are not as represented as a demographic.
And if so, not typically in higher positions, especially.
No. So to see her in all her glory, the afro, the smile, and I just remember thinking, wow. And I didn't really understand the value of that representation when I was first elected to school board. And it wasn't until I'd gone to a school event and I saw the faces of other African American students and their recognition and lighting up like, oh, and the light bulb going off and seeing how valuable and important that was. And so to have go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, real quick before you moved on to, because you think to yourself, oh, I can do that.
Right.
I think that's the light bulb
that I saw. Yes, that's exactly right.
So sorry, not to cut you off, but
no, it's the first time I saw myself reflected. Right.
Like
I saw someone who had a similar career path as myself, who is now a director in this, you know, multi-million-dollar corporation, enterprise corporation, and I saw me. Right? I saw myself.
And the fact that you could show up to work with your afro, and the fact that you could show up and
Well, now the first time I wore my natural hair wasn't until like natural hair without like all the accoutrements. Was at Ohio Equities. And I was the only African American manager at the time. I don't know if they've changed that since, but is the first time that I wore my natural hair and I felt completely at home. But they're like my family, so that was like not that big a deal. But to see it in a corporate environment, like a a very strict corporate environment is totally different experience. And now, I see women walking around, they rock their braids. I had just had mine not too long ago before I cut my hair. But, just to see our true authentic selves and people not all worked up about what'd you do with your hair and all those weird microaggressive conversations happening. It was just such a freeing experience to see her. She's like an EVP now. She's like a boss.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Her.
Oh, that's awesome.
She's got a smile that lights up the world, and it's something that I
would you name her for us? Could we give a quick shout out?
She knows who she is.
She knows? Okay, good.
She knows who she is. I wouldn't mind if she knew. I wouldn't do that to her.
No, I understand.
But yeah, she's just I think back to those two women and the way that they sort of impressed upon me different things without even trying or knowing that they did. They were gifts to me as a woman of color, particularly in a predominantly white environment.
Yeah, I will say I for the first time ever last year wore braids to work. And it was an interesting kind of internal conflict for me because, and here's the thing too, right? When I go and talk about this to some of my peers and things like that, they're like, why was this such a internal thing for you? And I'm like, because I never saw women come into work with their braids. Everyone came with a silk press. Everyone came late, honey. And the thing about that is, at the end of the day, I don't know if you've seen the Dove hair care, they're doing the Crown Act and everything now. And I got my first headshot with my natural hair done. And I made a LinkedIn post about it, and it blew up, and people were like, and then I saw some comments that were like, why is this a big deal? I don't understand why this is a big deal. Because having to put in the extra effort to lean into my Eurocentric look is something that should not be I should be able to show up the way I show up.
I think some people are looking at it through a lens that has not ever had to consider that side of it, right? My son just got a position. He wants to be a wealth management kind of guru when he gets out of college, and that's what he's studying in finance.
We love the financial independence.
Yeah, and of course, I realize I'm critiquing every choice that he's made to wear.
Yes.
Because I'm like, you're a young black man, you're going in this environment, you need to present, and he's like, Mom, dial it back. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Duly noted.
Yeah.
But at the same time, to have the privilege to never have to consider those factors, right? Our counterparts sometimes show up to work and nobody's asking those questions. Nobody's looking, but those things arrive before you look at my resume, before you have a conversation with me.
Yes.
And it was interesting because my colleague last week referred to me as spicy. and I thought, okay, I know her. Yeah. I know her personally, and I love her.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, what the intention behind that statement wasn't how it landed. Yes. So one, you have to check yourself sometimes in spaces where you have to, provide a little grace.
Yes.
But I thought, geez, I don't know that she would describe my other colleague as spicy. And she's just as assertive or knowledgeable. And, so it was interesting. I let it land, and then I had to sit with it. So we'll talk when I leave.
Yeah, we'll get there. What's interesting, and this is actually a conversation I was having the other day. I read this article one time, and it was talking particularly about the way that Spanish people are perceived when they come here. And this article was so incredible at breaking down some of the things that we see, some of the biases, exactly. And one of the things that it was talking about was, so for example, on the islands. So in DR, it's hot. We're right by the equator, honey. It is steaming. One of the things that you do when it's warm is you wear, either lighter clothing, like linen type materials, or just show a little more skin, naturally. And in the article, it was talking about, people that are from these hotter climates. This is something that they're, across their nation, the wear is this way. Lighter materials, maybe like showing a little bit more skin on the clothing, whatever it may be. And also there, brighter colors. A lot of our foliage and things reflect bright, tropical colors, things like that. And so Hispanic people typically are, used to seeing and wearing those type of colors. And the article was saying how, like, here, teenage Latina women are typically deemed as spicier because they're wearing a little less clothes. They're wearing brighter colored clothing. Also, a thing in the islands, there's usually music playing all across the streets. There's usually a lot of dancing and.
It was like that when I went to Puerto Rico.
Yes, it's just like that. Open streets, people are always playing music, people are always dancing, things like that. And so naturally, the decibel is higher. And we speak over each other. And that's even something, people of color in general, you kind of do that game, we talk a little bit. And they were saying, the bias here is, Latina women are so loud, but it's also a result of the environment by which we were breeded and that we come from. And I just thought that was such an interesting thing of seeing how our backgrounds and our ecosystems lend to the way that we deem as we live normally. And then when you take that context out of it, bias sets in. So I just thought that was such an interesting.
I've spent my career learning to what people probably call code switch.
Yes.
But learn how to measure myself because I come from a family of very strong women.
Yes.
And it's rare that you will find I'm not going to speak my mind. Yeah. I'm never rude or obnoxious.
I'm gonna say what I need to say.
Well, but especially if you ask me, if you ask my opinion, my voice is my voice.
Yeah.
And so I've spent my career learning how to measure that. I do feel like I'm at a point now in my career where I'm less concerned about someone else's bias, and that probably comes from the years that I've spent serving on school board because we spent nearly a decade trying to break down that sort of system, and that culture, if you will. So I'm less concerned with needing to measure myself. I guess you could say I'm more comfortable in my own skin.
Yeah.
But that is a very real experience for women of color. I mean, it's a real experience. My son is 6'6", 230. He looks like a brick wall. And, how does he not shrink himself but still not, show up and have to deal with someone else's bias? But again, that's also about them and not about you.
Yeah. So. What would you say, because you have now raised almost every generation of children.
All five
and I would love to know a little bit about your experience with doing that. What do you think are some of the major differences? And
so I take care of my mom, who's a boomer.
Yes.
I'm Gen X, my husband and I, and then it just goes down there goes from there.
Yeah.
I would say by virtue of just trying to make sure I have my pulse on what's happening with my teenage children, I have learned the lingo.
Yes.
But I also, there's a time where I'm like, be free, do whatever. But then when they can't get through a sentence with me because they're using the slang, I correct it.
Yeah.
And say, hey, if you're talking to someone at a job, you can't say those words. They're not going to understand what you're talking about. So what are you trying to tell me?
Yeah.
But I would say the biggest difference is the way the communication styles are completely, utterly different.
Yes.
And I have people on my team that are of different generations.
Yeah.
So understanding how they communicate, and really understanding what motivates them, because the motivators are very different, extremely different. That's been, I think, the key for how I sort of navigate it. It doesn't, I notice the different generations because they live in my home. Right. But I don't obsess, like it doesn't.
Yeah, like make its way into your...
I don't, it's like, hey, come as you are. Yeah. Figure it out.
I will say to me, like because like me and my brother are having a conversation about code switching the other day. And like I will say this younger generation of kids, they are much less concerned. They're free, honey. They do not. Because like
that's how it should be.
That's I agree. Like I really something that I have really come to commend and really encourage my brother with is the fact that like when you talk about people that are just more built, it seems, for like being confident. Like
you've got to figure that generation for like the last 20 years has come up in a time of extreme tumultuous political, societal change. Everything, standards have changed. What's out and open and free was not that way 20 plus years ago. And so they live their lives courageously out loud, and I'm here for it.
And honestly, as a mother, as you should be, because
I mean, I would rather someone show up every day authentically, whoever they are, rather than try to be boxed into something, because they'll never realize their full potential that way. And if I'm trying to get someone's full potential, highest production, whatever, they're going to do that when they're comfortable with who they are, where they are, and how they show up. So
I agree. I think that particularly plays a role when you are doing things like negotiating your own advancement. And when you ask for more, you have to show up and be able to say, I'm worth more. And to feel that you're worth something, to feel that you're worth, that you have to have a certain level of confidence. You have to have a certain level of security within yourself. I understand you probably had to negotiate your advancement a couple times. What would you say to that experience? And what can you kind of talk to our listeners about going through that? What kind of advice can you give?
Well, so one thing that I have prided myself in over the span of my career is really understanding and becoming a subject matter expert. So when it comes to property management and real estate, there's things I don't know, sure. But when it comes to how do you run a building or run a campus or run a portfolio and get its highest performance, profitability, all those things, I know that backwards and forwards. I can do that with my eyes closed. And the one thing that I had someone, a recruiter actually, he was so gracious. He said to me, oh, you're just too expensive. And I thought, that's a pretty cool compliment.
I'll take that.
It's a pretty cool compliment. And I said, hey, I get that. I totally get that. Rare that you're going to find someone with my years of experience, knowledge of that particular product, and understand how to position it. But if that's still not a fit, that's okay. I'm heavily connected to people. I know a lot of talent. Be happy to pass someone your way that your opportunity would be a blessing for them. And I had to get to a point where like I have worked to a certain point in my career that I don't want to compromise what I earn, and I don't think that I should. But at the same time, I don't, people, you have to show them what the investment is too. You do. Like you can't just say, "Oh, give me more, give me more, give me more." Well, what's the investment? And my track record shows that.
I think for that too, you have to invest in yourself.
Yes.
Like you've spent years probably learning the HVAC systems and learning the way that these buildings breathe and live and work. And for that, one of my favorite interview questions is, what is on your resume or what is not on your resume that I should know about?
Right.
Because that kind of stuff, you can't put some of those things on paper, but if you talk to me on it, you're gonna know.
It's so interesting too when you interview for positions. The questions are they're somewhat generic and they don't really get to the heart of, what does someone actually know? And sometimes when I'm interviewing, I'm looking for personality. I'm looking for how you respond in stress, how you, and I don't need a perfect answer.
Yeah.
I just need a human, right? Like I need a human that understands human condition and understands what they're going to be expected to do, right? So understanding how your buildings operate and how they run, or whatever your field is, just being a subject matter expert is really important, because those are things that I call on, like, without having to, I got to go read a book, or I've got to go Google it. Like, I already know, I understand. And when I'm talking to a vendor, it helps those conversations go really smoother and quicker too, especially in emergency situations. If I understand what they do and how they help what I need, so they don't have to educate me.
And that also comes from you asking the questions too, because I think that's a big thing, for all my property managers out there. You should definitely be, if you can meet your vendor out there, go meet your vendor, honey. Ask the questions. Get to the root of what is going on, because that kind of stuff can really change your game in terms of what you are understanding and bringing to the table when you have to communicate the same message to the stakeholder that is going to be paying for these repairs.
Absolutely. And you need to be able to translate it into, like, just normal conversation so they can understand, right? Like, they're not going to understand, humidity levels or whatever unless that's what they have to know. Like in a pharmacy, for example, they're not gonna, just a regular, person working in an office building isn't gonna know that. So you have to be able to articulate. You got to ride both sides of that fence. You've got to be able to decode what is being told to you, and then how to communicate that back.
That's a different type of code switching. Is what you have to, the way that you take the information and display it. Because that's another thing. I mean, for us, like, we have people that prefer charts and graphs. We have people that prefer to see it in sentences. It's better when you have those skills, and those are skills that you can name in your interview when you're trying to level up. You get to break that down and let the way that you articulate yourself and what you know about your industry be what speaks for, give me, this extra $10,000-$15,000 a year in salary. Because let's be real, like, we all want to move up in the world.
Sure.
But if you want to move up, you have to level up. And that comes from...
just becoming an expert at what you do. Absolutely. And being confident in that. I would say largely, like I said, there's things that I don't know. But when it comes to building operations and operational procedures and those sorts of things, there's a level of comfort that I have in just sort of navigating that space. But you do have to meet people where they are. And not be like, snarky about it. You just have to be willing to, like, kind of
have some humility about displaying that information.
Picking up what they're hung up on. Like, sometimes people get hung up on one thing, and they fixate on it. So you've got to help kind of draw them into another direction.
How would you say that you move people along the process of understanding certain data points that will get them to the finish line, when you think that when people are hung up on a certain place that's kind of deviating from the main point of conversation? How do you gently...
That happens a lot in school board. School board members tend to fixate on data points. Things that they are, like, hung up on. One, you have to be a good listener. You have to listen to what someone is saying to you. Ask a clarifying question. Make sure that you understand what it is that they're hung up on. And a lot of times, especially when you're trying to build consensus, if you're on two sides of something and you got to get to a decision point, if all these other things weren't a factor.
Oh, that's my favorite question.
If none of those things were a factor, what would you want? What do you need? What gets you to your point of I can operate?
One of my favorite things too, and kind of a version of that question, is almost doing like the doctor scale, like from 1 to 10, how are you feeling on this, or where do you feel that you are on blank? And if they say 6, what's the difference between a 6 and an 8? This, what's the difference between an 8 and a 10? And helping people move along that way, because the other thing is, you can't shove someone into learning something. It also kind of has to come from their own process.
Yeah, it's huge when you especially when we were talking about shifting long-held cultural biases and beliefs and systems and those sorts of things. And when you're meeting someone where they are, you really are taking a moment to say what grounds us in this moment, right? Like, what can we all agree on?
Yes.
Like, if you have a starting point of what you can agree on, a lot of times you find that you're not that far apart.
Right.
The 8 to the 10, the 6 to the 8 is not that far apart, right? And that's a communication moment. That's a moment of saying, okay, what do you need right now to get to the 8, to get to the 10?
Yeah.
And then there's also times where you have to be willing to say, okay, we've come to an impasse, and this thing is not going to solve itself, and this thing is not going to be solved. So how can we move forward?
Yeah. Both regarding,
you have to be willing to give.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
On both sides.
It has to be a compromise. I think a lot of times in two things happen. A lot of times we look at our position in relation to our client or who we're working with or whoever it may be, and you don't want to be the one that is subservient and gives it all, right? But here's the thing is that you have to give a little, they have to give a little, and it's about holding that equal business stature and understanding that we both have a role to play in this transaction or this.
Yes, but I also feel like, at least in my role, like my client is my client is my client. And so, but for that relationship, I wouldn't even be there. So it's less about me and more about them. Now, if I just have a client just trying to break the rules, then I'm like, no. Yeah. Here's why.
Yeah.
No, you can't put, your
that
grandmother's decorations all over an office building. Like, it's just not okay.
Yeah. That white part's important because a lot of times people just need the context.
Right.
A lot of times people just need to understand, because it's like when your parent says no. Why? Because I'm the parent.
Right.
That don't fly. So yeah.
That's not gonna go. No, a lot of times it's just really giving people context and communicating that.
Yeah.
And some people are really uncomfortable with like that level of confrontation or that level of I don't want to disappoint someone. But sometimes being honest is being kind, and being honest is a level of integrity too. Yes.
Because if people can tell at the very least that you have the right intention in this interaction, that's one thing I will always say is that sometimes people just don't have the best delivery, or sometimes their delivery almost leads you to believe that they're coming from a completely different standpoint. But if at the very least we can understand the intention behind, ask people, what is your intention with this conversation? What is your end goal? What is your mission? Let's talk about my mission.
I had my boss say that something I was struggling with is she's like, what would be a desirable outcome?
Yes.
And I hadn't thought that far because I was busy
trying to get it across,
feeling what I was feeling. I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah.
Like when she asked me, it was just like, okay, what is a desirable outcome? And I, had to sit with that for a second. And
then you can build a path.
Yes, and that's exactly what I did.
And sometimes when you go about doing that on your own, you can see that the way they were trying to get the path, it kind of mirrors what you were trying to do. And that is really what compromise looks like. It's really just trying to figure out what is your end goal. And when you even find out your end goal as well, then we can both work on, how we get there. I think about this thing that was talking about like a spectrum. And a lot of times when we think about spectrums, we think about it as this line, just a straight across line. And sometimes a spectrum looks more like a circle, an arch, where these two data points are not that far away, but you're taking a long way to get there. And it's really just about trying to understand where are you going, so we can both understand how you get there.
Right.
So I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on and speaking. And I just want to ask one last thing.
Sure.
If you had to leave our audience with anything from this conversation, what would be your biggest piece of advice, or the biggest thing that you wish someone would have said to you as an early on manager?
Oh, that's a tough one. I wish my younger self that someone would have said, I see you, and I think you can do really amazing things. and I want to take you under my wing. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. You're going to have to learn a lot. But if you do, this is where you're going to end up. And I feel like I do that now for people who come and work for me or with me. I try to do that for them because that would have been probably, I mean, I started in property management just to earn money for books in college, on the weekends.
Probably didn't think it would be your full-fledged career.
Never.
Yeah.
I didn't even think that. Actually, I was pre-law at the time.
Oh, shoot. Really?
Go figure. It makes sense to my family.
Yeah. They're like, she loves a debate.
Totally can see that. But yeah, so I that's what I would say is, and if you have an opportunity, I would say if you have an opportunity to learn a new skill, learn new information, and really become an expert at it, take it as an opportunity to embrace that, because that gives you a lot of depth in your career as you're trying to navigate. I mean, commercial real estate has a long way to go as far as like sort of opening its doors in a diverse way. And I'm not just talking about the lip service. I mean, like fundamentally, actually, intentionally creating pathways for people of color to come into this industry. And so I would just say, you know, if you have an opportunity to learn something new, either on your own, as part of professional development or whatever, do it, embrace it, because I do believe that's been sort of the secret to my success is that I have done a lot of different things across my career, from training to marketing to managing. I've never, ever fixed a thing though.
Hey, but you know what?
That's not my lane.
But
I understand how that thing is supposed to run.
Yes.
Right? I understand how that...
And that falls under what you...
Absolutely. And so in that regard, I have a lot of depth in terms of my knowledge and breadth in terms of what I can offer a client. And that's always very helpful. That gives you a level up and an edge. Yeah.
I would agree. I think sometimes in the moment, things that don't seem directly relevant, it's like, am I going to go out of my way to? Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, but you know, in this business, you might not see it right away, but like 6 months later, there it is.
There it is.
Like, oh, I remember
and it will
this.
Always pay off to just show that you care a little more by doing those little extra things.
Yes, absolutely.
Whatever that looks like.
Absolutely.
So if you are joining us again, thank you so much for coming back and listening to us. And please join us on our next episode. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our time.
As did I. Thank you, and see you later. All right, girl, we did it.